Welcome to the Catherine Vandome and Me podcast.
Hello and welcome to Catherine Vandome and Me. And today I'm joined by a very talented guest who is the UK's leading paediatrician of ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis, also sometimes called chronic fatigue syndrome. My guest is a doctor who has almost 40 years hands-on medical experience of diagnosing patients, children all over the world with this chronic debilitating condition. Now, as you know, I have written a book called The Truth About Me, and I'm very honoured that my guest has also made a wonderful contribution to this book within one of the chapters, outlining the medical treatment, diagnosis, and all that he has experienced. And today I can't wait to meet and get to know Dr. Nigel Speight. Hello there, Dr. Speight. Can I call you doctor or Nigel? What would you like me to call you?
Probably Nigel would be okay.
Is that okay? Well, it's with great pleasure to introduce you today, Nigel, because it is thanks to the work of pioneers like your great self, who, as I've explained in the introduction, have almost 40 years hands-on experience of my health condition, of which I was bedbound with very severe ME in 2014. So as a patient that went to that terrible level, because there are different levels in severity, I admire, respect and support all of your work, and I've been following you for quite a long time now. So how are you doing today, first of all? I see your backdrop is a playground to sort of emphasise being a paediatrician.
This used to be our children's playground, and now it's for the grandchildren when they come.
Oh, fantastic. It looks great. And I think that highlights and emphasises a little bit about your background. So what I want to do, Nigel, is take you onto a journey so that the audience gets to know the real Dr. Nigel Speight. And most importantly, can you just give us a few words of insight into what you do, and then we'll take you back in time to your childhood, if that's okay?
Well, currently I retired some years ago, but ever since I retired, I've carried on working. One of the reasons is that I want to keep registered so that I can help children with ME. And I still feel a sort of duty to this because there are so few doctors willing to step outside their own geographical area. So I'm willing to kind of see children all over the country. I've just done a lecture tour of Ireland, and I saw 30 young people with ME in Ireland as well. And there's still a great need and a demand for people to get an official diagnosis.
Absolutely.
And I'm also advising on, and a lot of my work is advocacy for families in real trouble. And I've helped families in Norway, Sweden, Holland, Germany, and currently one in France.
Wow. Absolutely incredible. And, you know, I think anybody watching, whether you are a patient with ME or an actual medical professional as well, I think they're going to gain great wisdom from watching everything you have to say today. So so in recent times, you've just come back from Ireland. And how was that? How was that experience?
It was fascinating. It was, there were some very positive things. I was quite pleased to see that there weren't as many horror stories as I've had in England. There are certain differences, although I'm an enormous supporter and believer in the principle of the health service. I had a feeling that in Ireland, where they don't have a free NHS and people pay for their doctors, the doctors tend to be a bit nicer to their patients with ME, perhaps for business reasons. But I did come across one or two families who had been persecuted and disbelieved and had great trouble getting support. But there are one or two very nice doctors in Ireland who are in some ways carrying out the kind of role that I do in England.
And am I right to say that currently you really are the, you know, the biggest, most known doctor paediatrician in particular of ME, most widely accepted, because some of your peers before perhaps have sadly passed now, but they've handed that baton to you. And if anybody wants to get in touch as a medical doctor, you certainly have that insight and support for children globally, as you say, all over the world. And how can they get in touch with you, Nigel?
Well, firstly, the reason I may be perhaps the one with the most experience is because, as you say, sadly, my colleague and friend Alan Franklin, who had at least as much experience as me, died more than a few years ago. There was another lady doctor who was an academic who ran an ME centre in the southwest, but I've just heard within the last week that she is actually retired early. So, and I don't know any other doctor in the country who actually is willing to go outside his geographical area and give opinions on people.
Absolutely.
There are plenty of individual paediatricians who are probably diagnosing and treating their children with ME perfectly, humanely and competently, but they don't naturally, in being in full-time employment, want to cross boundaries and give second opinions on other people's cases, because it's,
my goodness,
potentially controversial.
Say that again, Nigel.
It's potentially controversial if you go in and give a second opinion counter to the local doctor.
Right. So these are the constraints that you face that a lot of people perhaps won't understand when they go see their own GP, like I did. I was told, come back in 6 months and then I can diagnose you. Well, I was nearly dead in bed. I'm in Dr. Raymond Perrin, who I know you know very well. He's an osteopath and neuroscientist into the treatment of ME and with adults and children, and he's worked alongside you a lot as well. So but as you say, he's an osteopath and a neuroscientist, but when we're sticking into the medical profession, the doctors are bound and constrained, perhaps not just with ME, perhaps with other conditions also, but they're bound by the medical diagnosis and constraints of what they are advised to say and to do with their patients. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, I should say there's an very interesting and topical area is the extent to which long COVID can create a condition very similar to ME, and it's probably best to call it long COVID ME all in one word. And there's a lady doctor, a very fine lady doctor called Dr. Benita Kane, who currently is providing a lot of diagnostic support to patients with long COVID ME outside her own area. And she is willing to give opinions around the country and actually has a private clinic for people with long COVID ME. And my very close colleague, Dr. William Weir, who's an adult physician, very much carries out a similar role to mine for adult patients with ME and is very, very much in demand for all the same reasons.
And what I understand, having gone through the mill myself the last 10 years, is that I couldn't understand that as an exerciser-holic. I was an entertainer, stand-up comedian, working. I painted my entire house. I mean, I certainly wasn't lazy or any of those descriptions. And I just couldn't understand why I wasn't believed immediately back in 2014. So on my personal frontier, I campaigned through Parliament with the ex-Defence Minister, Mr. Wallace, and I know that you also have campaigned tirelessly as well to prove that this condition is a physical and not a psychological condition. Now, we did win between us all, because I know, hats off to everybody globally. This isn't an individual achievement. This has been years, decades in your experience of trying to prove to the medical establishment that the condition is physical. Now, we did win in 2018, I think it was. The NICE guidelines were then changed in 2021. And if you can tell us a little bit about that victory for all of us. Go on, Nigel.
Yes, this is one of the best news, and I've actually found it a great relief the last few years, because, I mean, historically, I think you'll probably know, going way back, we thought we'd won in 2002 with the then Chief Medical Officer's report, which actually stressed how genuine it was. And the Chief Medical Officer says patients should not be dismissed as malingerers, but somehow the psychiatrist fought back, and it got muddy. The waters got muddied again, And then in 2007, NICE produced some quite good guidelines, but they gave endorsement to two forms of therapy, graded exercise and cognitive behavioral therapy, both of which depend on the theory that this is not really a disease, it's just due to abnormal illness beliefs and deconditioning, and everyone can be made better if they get enough graded exercise and enough CBT. Now, everyone knew that was wrong, but it led to 15 years of benefits being withheld if people didn't agree to have graded exercise and things like that. And, you know, parents who declined graded exercise because it was making their child worse, being referred to social services for not following medical advice. And all through that time, my opponents would criticize me for not following NICE guidelines. The beautiful thing is, with NICE 2021, the boot is now firmly on the other foot, and I'm following NICE guidelines, and NICE guidelines have got it right. They have debunked graded exercise and CBT, and I still am astonished to find there are certain people in quite big centres who are promoting it against NICE guidelines, and one is able to actually point this out to them. The parents can wave NICE guidelines at them. And when I was in Ireland, I was able to say how much better things are now in England. Ireland don't have any guidelines at all. And I just said, well, you've got to use NICE guidelines until you get your own. And I also encourage people with long COVID ME to call it ME, because then they are protected from NICE guidelines.
Yes.
Because otherwise, if you have long COVID, you're going to, all the people who are now unemployed and graded exercise and cognitive behavioral therapy would love to move into long COVID and start doing research on graded exercise for long COVID. And therefore, NICE guidelines have been particularly good on both those fields. And in my lectures in Ireland, I was stressing them and praising NICE guidelines. And it's really one of the best things that's happened. And I think we can congratulate the researchers on NICE for getting it right. I should mention that Dr. Weir was on the panel that helped to produce that. And
wow.
it's very good in lots of ways. They're very good for diagnosis. They're very good for management. They're also very good for the management of severe ME, which is another challenging area which I've been involved in more and more recently.
Wow. Well, huge praise to all the people pedaling like the duck's legs behind, because as you say, you weren't necessarily on the panel. And for anybody who hasn't yet had the privilege of meeting you, Nigel, you have almost 40 years been peddling this and explaining with your wisdom. And again, the ability to think outside of the box as a medical professional is integral to this. And some are calling long COVID ME, some are saying it's long COVID/ME. Some are saying it's identical with 100 identical symptomology, of which I think I had 99 of those symptoms. So as soon as I heard about this, I was straight on the phone to the television production companies when it was on the news, particularly to the people who I was watching collapsing. And I was saying, you've got identical symptoms to me, let me help you. So like your good self, there's a lot of people who, like Dr. William Weir as well, who are actually pioneering and have been able to stand up and explain and provide documentation to the contrary of it being a psychological condition. And we can now finally say and put that to bed and say it is absolutely not all in the patient's mind. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. But while we're on long COVID, I should mention that in addition to the pure long COVID ME, which is very similar to common or garden ME, there are some additional complications in some cases of long COVID in terms of organ damage, microclots and things like that. And therefore there is a need for more research and specialization in that area. But the one thing they don't need is disbelief and rejection and being left without support. And the numbers are massive. I mean, and I think the government would prefer it not to exist. And it's quite interesting, when it first developed, the long COVID community held themselves askance they didn't unite with the ME community. They thought that the ME community was stigmatized and that they were in a better position. Actually, it's the other way around now because of NICE guidelines. And I encourage long COVID community to make common cause with the ME community. And it's possible that the research that may go into long COVID will have a benefit on the ME community.
Absolutely. What you're saying is there's so many overlapping, as I've said, at least 100 symptoms. Some cases have additional, but then that would also, if I'm right, be the case with ME patients as well. I know ME patients who have secondary heart conditions or lung damage. I myself have secondary carbon monoxide poisoning, which had a profound effect on my ability to breathe from a broken flue pipe in my kitchen, for example. So every single patient case is different and individual, but we all have these overlapping symptomologies, and the most extreme cases, like myself, are obviously hardest hit with more symptoms. So when I hear poor people, and what I want to get across today is your field of expertise is, please remember, audience, children. So children can't speak for themselves. And I know as an adult, I was 39 when I collapsed. I couldn't physically turn my head on a pillow. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I had no idea what was going on. And I think when you get to that extreme level, Nigel, and I know that you have supported, I've been watching your work, multiple cases where these children have potentially been put into the wrong sort of opportunities within the NHS, and I want you to tell me a little bit more about that, some of the children's lives that you have been an integral part of saving.
Well, perhaps I could start with how I first got interested in ME. I qualified as a consultant, never having been taught about it, hardly having heard about it, and started off perfectly happily doing my normal work. And then a 14-year-old girl turned up in a wheelchair at my clinic and announced she had ME. And I said, oh, I've vaguely heard of that. Tell me more about it. And she described her story. She was actually, her parents had got her in a support group in Durham, which I'd never heard about. So there were two GPs in the north of England, Dr. Irving Spur and Dr. Richardson, who actually stimulated a lot of interest, and they had great expertise. So actually the knowledge of ME in the adult community was quite advanced. And this girl opened my eyes to it. Her story was so genuine. She said she could just manage 3 days a week at school, but if she did more, she'd crash. Yeah. She used to do this. She used to be sporty. And it was just natural to believe her. It's interesting. Alan Franklin wrote an article describing an identical situation, how he first encountered a girl with ME in a wheelchair, and that's how he learned to believe in it. I have to say, I cannot understand how people who don't believe in ME don't believe in ME when you see a child with it, when you see a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed little boy who is a Boy Scout and he plays football and he goes to swimming club 3 times a week, who crashes down after flu and doesn't get back to school for 2 years. I mean, it is blindingly obvious. And if something quacks like a duck, looks like a duck and lays duck eggs, it's a duck. So yes. I can't understand people who disbelieve ME.
I think it goes alongside with what you have overcome over the last 40 years, and we'll go back in a second to your childhood. But I think it goes in tandem with that people are afraid. My condition happened overnight. So 1 minute I was on stage and literally the next day I collapsed bedbound. And I was highly active, painting my house, running around, 2 businesses, never ever sat still, but it happened within 24 hours and I wasn't believed. And how can you not believe somebody who's a dancer, singer, actor, who's suddenly unable to move. I remember crawling. It took 2 hours, 3 hours to crawl to bed because in my subconscious, I thought I'm going to die. And so my subconscious said, you better get to bed. And that's the second chapter of my book. And then after that, I've written the book with my stand-up comedy sort of character so that the reader can actually enjoy the experience of reading it and also get some insight into how physically active I was. But I think my story in particular shows that it is often very physically and mentally active patients, and they seem to get hit the hardest. So we're talking sports athletes, entertainers, dancers, footballers. Those are the subset who seem to go to the lowest level with this particular debilitating condition, unfortunately. And I also have secondary Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which has now also been merged into this subset as well. So, and fibromyalgia as well. So anybody watching who's been given a particular label, as you quite rightly said, whether it be long COVID, whether it be Lyme's disease, whatever the subset label, there is an overriding symptomology, identical symptomology of brain fog and all the other symptoms. And it's a case of finding the right support. First and foremost, though, being believed by a medical professional like your good self. That has to come first, being believed. So what I want to say to you is anybody who hasn't perhaps understood it or believed it, the great thing about opening today with what you've said is that in 2021, you have no counter argument now. ME is physical.
From the doctor's point of view, the biggest hurdle for doctors with a great rigid minds is their reluctance to diagnose simply on clinical grounds without tests.
Yes.
At a case conference where a lady doctor said, I am a scientific doctor and I cannot make a diagnosis if the tests are normal. That was ridiculous. There's a clinical diagnosis. The great teacher Wilfred Osler wrote in the turn of the last century that there was a condition which, to all intents and purposes, was ME. He called it neurasthenia, but he was stressing it was genuine and it was physical. And a good doctor who can take a history and believe the patient's that diagnosis depends on the history as much as anything else. And there's a beautiful story of a professor who told a little 6-year-old girl, there can't be anything wrong with you because all your tests are normal. And the 6-year-old girl replied, perhaps I've got a condition for which you haven't yet invented the correct test.
Oh, how profound from an age 6.
Game, set and match to the 6-year-old.
Oh my goodness.
And I just, that's a good dodge for patients to try on doctors who say that. But
yes.
And there is all this disbelief, and it's, you know, the medical profession, it's actually a horror story that the medical profession have in adult medicine. They've neglected the whole field for 50 years, 60 years, and left a vacuum which has been filled by the psychiatrists with the results we all know about. And I think the reason is adult medicine's become more specialized and everyone has their own little specialty. And they didn't create a specialty for ME. They told the neurologist it was their specialty. The neurologist hate ME and ran like a mile. So there wasn't an ology for ME. And therefore, adult medicine, teaching medical students, didn't exist. I remember when I first started as a consultant, one of my colleagues at the lunch table said, all my ME patients are nutters. In other words, that's disbelief and rejection.
Really?
And this runs through the whole history of medicine. And I had a friend in the Southwest who mentioned to her GP that she had ME, and he stood up, towered over her and said, Madam, I have been a doctor for 12 years, and I can assure you, if there was such a condition as ME, I would have bound to have heard of it. And that reflects medical education. It's not taught, therefore it can't exist.
And what we have to empathise with as a medical doctor yourself, and I have a lot of great friends who are superb medical doctors themselves, what we have to empathise with is that they are also being indoctrinated by a falsehood, let's say, and they are being encouraged by this channel today to look at the patient, as you quite rightly have highlighted. Look at them. What were they like 24 hours ago, 2 weeks ago, 3 years ago? Because sometimes it's a steady decline, which it was for myself. I was told there's no way that you end up bedbound if you don't already have it over a period of time. And it seems my condition could have potentially started as I was being born, because it affects the structural issues in the body. So and the drainage of the glymphatic system, the brain and the lymphatic system. So I very much want to support parents and medical doctors watching today to think outside the box, not just with ME, but potentially for any other diagnosis. Just because what you're seeing in front of you is pure fine bloods or whatever that you are given to test, as the little girl 6-year-old said, perhaps you've not got a test for it. Well, I think exercise would be a profound test for it, because I was an exerciseaholic and I now cannot exercise the way that I could. So so that in itself is evidence. But ask the patient, perhaps, and let them reveal what their symptoms are, and have integrity in your wisdom, as you have had, to step outside if you believe wholeheartedly this patient, whether it be the new diagnosis of long COVID, or as you quite rightly said, it used to be called neurasthenia. And indeed, when it was called neurasthenia, we had Sigmund Freud, who was a psychologist and neurologist, who actually said, would you believe back then, that there was spine and cranium irritation, which I have highlighted inside my book. So all those years ago, 100 years ago, he wasn't just looking at the psychology, he felt on the spine and the skull, which is what ME is, myalgic encephalomyelitis, inflammation of the brain and spine. And would you believe it, he himself, Sigmund Freud, pointed this out all those years ago, that it was more than psychology. So he also felt it was physiological. So we also had it called yuppie flu, and as a comedian myself, my mum highlighted that yuppie flu didn't come all the way up north because we weren't posh enough to catch it. So on a comedic level, which is how I try to highlight this condition in my book, there are ways to laugh our way out of the madness. But I want to throw that back to you. What's your feeling there?
Funnily enough, just when you're mentioning yuppie flu, I did a little bit of research on 49 consecutive patients, and I found that the social class gradient was just that of the normal population. It occurs in all social classes. The stories about the middle class ones, it's a myth, just they're the ones they remember. And I remember saying sardonically to the medical student sitting in my room, when we had a clearly very working class patient come in with ME after he'd gone out, I said, typical yuppie.
Very good.
But while I'm at it, I had another medical student sitting in with me, and I said, during the month you're with me, I'd like to convince you that ME is a physical illness. He said, you don't need to convince me, I've had it. I said, goodness, tell me your story. He said, oh, I was up at Oxford in my first year doing PPE, and I came crashing down at the first long vac. And never got back to college. And after 9 months, my GP referred me to my local DGH to see a consultant. And he thought that this consultant would take a history, examine me and do some tests and then give me a diagnosis. Not a bit of it. The consultant looked at the GP's letter, asked the nurse to leave the room, and then proceeded to tear a strip off him and said, if he had the guts to complete a university degree in these days of high unemployment, he should make way for better people. And he just sent him out. And that's what I'm talking about, the disbelief and the rejection of this. And as he limped away, he said, I could be a better doctor than that person.
Well, a doctor with empathy, which is what you have.
There he was in his 4th year medical school. He went into medicine. He still had symptoms. But that's the kind of disbelief I'm talking about. There's another story from the southwest of a GP who rang a helpline and said he was really worried he had ME. They said, well, why are you so worried? He said, well, you don't realize it's always been the policy in our practice to treat patients with ME with absolute rejection and ridicule. Yeah. And now I can't tell my fellow partners that I've got it. I'm going to take early retirement and say I'm depressed. And he regarded depression as having less stigma than ME. I mean, it's really tragic.
Yeah, I mean, you're either diagnosed with anxiety or depression. And my partner, incredibly, he's had ME for over 30 years. And as a man, the stigma can often be even greater. And he's called Mark Singleton, and I very much respect him because his suffering over that 3 decades is time that I was suffering behind the scenes, and I would keep collapsing and never knew why. And I was very sick all the time. But the actual bed bound is only, was 2014. So I've only lost 10 years of my sort of adult life, if that makes sense. But there are patients, as I'm sure you've met, who potentially some of them still are bed bound 30, 40 years later and still disbelieved. And indeed, some of them, had they not been made to push themselves and exercise in the early stages, I'll let you tell that story with your medical knowledge.
Yeah. But just to stress the lack of medical education, but also the way the influence of psychiatry, the psychiatric lobby, to fill the vacuum. They made sure that they were the ones who wrote the chapters in the major medical textbooks that undergraduates get. Of course, trying to relabel it chronic fatigue syndrome was half the battle to kind of make ME not a respectable term. The good thing, NICE guidelines now talk of ME CFS instead of CFS ME, which is good. But to this day, the major texts are written by psychiatrists. And the major text on pediatrics, until a few years ago, I haven't seen the latest one, you couldn't find ME in the index. You could find chronic fatigue syndrome. It was in the section on child psychiatry, and it said this is the commonest somatization disorder in childhood.
Oh my goodness!
And that's why we have. I think in the medical profession as a whole, I think things have got worse because of this bias in medical education to not mention it and to just have corridor sneers about it. When I first started, I sent a questionnaire to all my colleagues, consultant colleagues in the northern region, asking them their belief system. And 19 against 7 said physical. And they were good, old-fashioned doctors who could take a history, make their mind up and get off the fence. But we've now reared a whole lot of doctors. There's a marvelous doctor called Abraham Verghese, who gave a TED talk to Edinburgh students. He's the one who wrote the film, the book Cutting for Stone. And he says, we're rearing doctors in America who can't diagnose that a patient's only got one leg without a whole body CT scan and an orthopedic referral. This reliance on tests and not making
personal, rational, logical judgment. I mean, you train as a medical doctor, which we'll go back to now, but you train with all those years of delving through so many textbooks, but also hands-on physical diagnostics of so many different plethora of conditions, and your specialist area, obviously, in pediatrics. And what shocked me was to find in my own last 10 years of unpacking all this and writing my book, which has taken 8 years to write, The Truth About Me. I have to say that in unpacking all that, I had no knowledge of this condition myself, and indeed perhaps my presuppositions to this condition would have been commandeered by a medic telling me this is psychosomatic. So I think it's only when you are either struck with it, or your child is struck with it, or you are a medic struck with it, that those are the people in the most difficult position. I remember having a medic wheeling my wheelchair years ago through the hospital, and I was telling her about Dr. Raymond Perrin, who is saving my life, treating this condition, draining the poison out. And she whispered to me, please, can you give me a card out of your handbag, because if I say it in front of the doctor, he will laugh at me and I might lose my job. I thought that was quite profound, and I gave her the card, and she smiled and left as if the conversation hadn't happened. So a lot of medical professionals, of which she was, are also being mistreated in their industry. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, there's a famous doctor called Dr. Robin Brown who's written about her experiences. She started a whole charity about it. She was a trainee doctor in gastroenterology, struck down with very severe ME, and her indignation that she'd never been taught anything about it.
Yeah, and what do I do? Yeah.
And NICE have now said we have to get better education. Of course, the battle's not over. The other people make a comeback. There's lots of risks. They're staring defeat in the face, so they'll have to find some way of making a comeback. And one of the ways they're going to do it, as always, is to relabel graded exercise and call it activity management.
And I think there is a falsehood that we may degenerate, our health may go down if we don't keep up the exercise. And I think a deconditioning, and I was told that as well, and I thought, well, hang on a minute, the reason I'm in this boat is because I never sat still. My rest time was a Zumba class. So I want to go back, and I'd like to hear about the real Dr. Nigel Speight before the hat of doctorhood, and take you right back to your childhood, Nigel. So first of all, where were you born?
Mysore, India.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Okay. Tell us a little bit more and about your parents, Nigel.
I visited the hospital I was born in 15 years ago and found my birth records handwritten in ink, and my £8.10, everything.
Oh my goodness, so quite a big baby. I was only £5 or a normal size perhaps.
I was 3 weeks overdue.
Wow. My goodness.
My father was a medical missionary.
Was he? Explain a bit more.
He came from a Methodist family. His father was a minister. His grandfather was a minister. He went to Kingswood, the Methodist boarding school, and then he was always going to go and do God's work. He actually wasn't the kind of evangelical temperament. He was a doctor rather than a preacher, but he did 13 years in the mission field in India, and that's why I was born there.
Oh my goodness. And your mum, can I hear a little bit about your mum?
She majored in motherhood. I had 3 sisters living out on the mission field. She had to do all the support and that sort of thing. My father came back to England when I was 10. The family came back when I was 10, and he was a GP. He became a GP for the rest of his career. And again, my mother was the receptionist and telephonist who had to do that and also look after us. But,
well, behind every good man is a good woman.
Absolutely. And you saw one of them today.
Your own good woman.
And
so it's so true.
It may have some influence over my subsequent life, is that I was sent to boarding school in India at the age of 6. So for 4 years, I was in a boarding school. And
how was that, Nigel? How was that?
It wasn't abusive. I wasn't bullied. It was just cold and puritanical and emotionally depriving. And my mother did her very best to mitigate the harmful effects of boarding school by staying in the hill station where we were for about 18 months of the 4 years. So there was weekend access and that sort of thing. And I never got the feeling I was sent away because I'd been naughty. It was very reluctant, but it was not a good time for me. I remember feeling extremely happy that we were coming back to England. The main reason was that we could be a family rather than what the missionaries did, send their kids back to boarding school in England. So I had a very happy secondary school in Liverpool in a very nice direct grant school called Merchant Taylors, which was some of the happiest years of my life, with lots of sport and rugby and tennis and cricket and girlfriends and square dancing and everything.
Oh, fantastic. So that gives us a little bit of insight into you. And you were inspired, is that right, by your father being a GP?
And missionary. Yeah, I mean, he was a surgeon. He was a missionary surgeon. He did over 1,000 major operations. He had to teach himself. He went out 18 months after he qualified and was just pitched into it.
And what did he give you, Nigel, as an inspirational father figure? What insight in the first, let's say, 10 years when you're watching him? I know you were away as well a lot, but in those pivotal times, what insight and wisdom did he give you? Was he the same free-thinking gentleman as yourself?
He was. He was actually a conscientious objector.
Was he?
He might have been jailed or interned, but they decided to let him carry on being a doctor in British India.
Goodness.
But
Wow.
I think the wisest thing he ever said to me, I naturally had to consider medicine as an option, and I didn't really have much idea about other kinds of medicine. But and one of the reasons I went into medicine was, firstly, I'd heard it was 6 years course, and I thought that would be 6 years of university holidays, and I only found after 3 years that I was wrong. But the other was I was wrestling with whether I was a pacifist or not. We'd just finished the years of call-up. The Korean War was on, and I thought if I was a doctor, I wouldn't have to make my mind up whether I was a pacifist or not. But my father, when I coughed up that I was thinking of medicine when I was 14, which was mainly to tell grown-ups to stop asking me what I was going to do, he didn't say, "Jolly good, my boy." He was a very gentle and democratic guy who believed everyone should find their own way. He said, "Well, I don't think you'll regret it, because whatever kind of person you turn out to be, there'll be a place in medicine for you."
Oh, what wonderful words.
Wasn't it? It didn't say you have to be like me or this sort of thing.
Wow. And your mum as well, if you can bring us a little bit of a flower of her character. What was she? What did she bring to you, Nigel?
More than my father, she was a natural campaigner and believer in good causes. They were both working for nuclear disarmament in the 60s. She taught us all about the suffragettes. She taught us all about the bishops in the Church of England who kept voting for the death penalty for sheep stealing. Told us all about the Irish famine and things like that. We were very politically aware. I remember they had a vinyl record of Nelson Mandela's speech at his defense trial, which had to be spoken by an actor because the one where he was very nearly condemned to death. And I remember hearing that record in the 60s. So they knew, they were very active and politically conscious. And my mother was an endless sort of questioner and campaigner.
So both very pro-humanitarian as your good self. So both, two incredible supportive mechanisms for you in your, the way that you have approached doctorhood in your adult life. And I think that is interesting for the reader to hear your authenticity as a medical doctor, because you face trials and tribulations in your own journey. And it's so important that anybody watching today can feel, which I can through the channel, your integrity, your wisdom, your honor, and your absolute duty of care to serving those less fortunate than yourself, which in your case is children. And I think that's incredible to hear a little bit about.
And I think the boarding school experience had to have given me some sort of empathy with deprived children.
Without doubt.
There was a boy who wet the bed who was teased.
Oh.
The first missionary school I went to was so horrible that a girl who wet the bed had a placard rung round her neck saying, "I wet the bed, keep away from me." It was Dickensian.
So you were already seeing things that perhaps the average person would not be privy to from a very, very young age. And as you quite rightly said, that obviously inspired you to help save lives yourself, which is what you have graciously done.
I remember on the boat, we came back on a 3-week boat trip when I was 10. And there were a lot of Australians and there were quite a few Indians. And the Australians were quite racist. And I automatically supported the Indians who defeated them at deck cricket, at which I was delighted.
Yes, of course.
And I've always supported the underdog. If I'm watching a football match, I change allegiance with each goal, whoever the underdog is.
I think that comes from the core of who you are, Nigel, as well. And so moving forward, you basically in your secondary school, how was that? And how did you develop then to getting into medicine? Did you take all of the appropriate subjects there?
Yes. I was put in a fast track to Oxbridge. So I left school very young, and I actually got into Cambridge and finished Cambridge before my 21st birthday.
Goodness me.
I was very, very green. And my first year at Cambridge was probably one of the unhappiest and loneliest of my life.
Oh, and why was that?
I was just, Cambridge was a very artificial place in those days. It was 90% male.
Okay.
It was heavily proper public school.
Yes. Yeah.
I'll remember a fellow medical student who'd been to a public school saying to me in the first week, I think it's jolly good this coming to university, you know, you really see how the other half live. I just met someone who went to grammar school.
When you're at Cambridge, the first year wasn't so good, but you got through and you achieved your degree. Can I ask what your degree was in? That was in doctorhood, I would assume.
Well, no, you had to do natural sciences.
Okay.
It was the reason it didn't excite me was it had so little to do with medicine. We didn't see patients. We had no role models of doctors. It was just basically a science, anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, and pathology.
Right. So,
and then the big change when I went to London to University College Hospital, all of a sudden we were going to be trained as doctors.
and how did that feel, Nigel? Because you started to smile then, so you can see remnants of the things that lit you up in your past. So how did that feel?
Because the first 3 years had so little to do with medicine, I even talked of giving up medicine. Nothing inspired me. I worked hard, got the exams, and then the 3 years at UCH were quite incredible because it was a very high-powered sort of place. Lots of the consultants did private practice and did plastic surgery on the royal family and this sort of thing, and it was a kind of high pressured cocoon and everyone was competing with each other to get the first jobs when we qualified, and I used to think I'm not cut out to be a doctor because I couldn't share my colleagues' enthusiasm at breakfast where they said I saw a fascinating case of carcinoma of the rectum yesterday. So I was naturally sort of squeamish, and I said there's something wrong with me. I'm not fascinated by disease. But there were certain aspects of UCH. It was a very good medical school, very progressive, and there were several people who inspired me. We actually had incredible psychiatrists. People talk of me of being anti-psychiatry. Actually, we had such super psychiatrists there. I did consider being a psychiatrist.
Wow.
There was one chap, he was a bit like John Cleese, a great man called Robert Treadgold, and he would give a lecture on something like suicide, and it would be the funniest lecture you'd ever heard.
Well, this is what I was going to say. Comedy can transcend all areas. I'm a stand-up comedian, but comedy can absolutely. Laughter is the best medicine. I say it to Dr. Perrin every single week in treatment. Laughter is the best medicine. Are there any funny stories in addition to that you can share, Nigel?
There's a lovely one about him. He was a very tall and angular, aquiline character who was actually an Olympic fencer. And he was once doing a clinic late, so he changed into his he had a bout at Earl's Court. He changed into his Olympic fencing gear, rushed out and flagged down a taxi and said, "Quick, take me to Earl's Court." And the chap drove round and deposited him back in his own psychiatric hospital.
That's incredible. And I'm sure, did he open with a story like that? That's incredible.
He also put on a beautiful, you learn better from bad examples sometimes.
Of course
he had a beautiful act he put on with a psychiatric social worker on how not to conduct a consultation. And this worried, middle-aged woman patient came in and said how she had this terrible stomach ache and it was going round and round. And the physician obviously just sent him straight to a psychiatrist. And throughout the consultation, he called her Mrs. and she kept correcting him and saying Miss. And then she kept saying, "But it's like a red hot circular saw, doctor." He said, "Never mind about that." And then he finally kind of took his glasses off and said, "Well, what we've decided, madam, is that you're suffering from an anxiety neurosis. And you're just going to have to tell your subconscious to pull itself together." And he said, "Every mistake in this consultation has been witnessed in real life."
Wow. Well, that's it. You draw on your own. Yeah,
You know
give me,
the
Nigel.
joke, what's the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist?
Go on.
£60,000 a year. And you know the difference between an orthopedic surgeon and God?
Go on.
God knows his limitations.
Because
Okay.
I'm trying to define here what guided you to become a doctor.
Well, firstly, we were used as sort of slaves. It was pure apprenticeship. We had very little teaching. We were just thrown into the deep end, and we felt quite inadequate. And the only times we felt, the two things that kept me going were the two things that you could have hands-on, and that was casualty, where we were allowed to stitch people up and do things like that, and that was exciting, and obstetrics, where we delivered babies. And we had a very progressive professor who said that every student doing his 20 deliveries had to stay with the mother throughout her labor. So if it was a 36-hour labor, we had to stay. And I loved that. We did episiotomies and sewed them up, and we rubbed the mother's back and gave. My first delivery, the mother had a terrible long labor, and I stayed with her throughout. And she had a kind of total transverse arrest, and had to have forceps. And I was holding a hand, and she was gripping mine, and I was giving her sips of ice. And the anaesthetist came in, assumed I was the husband, and asked me to leave.
That's incredible. What a story.
And lots of mothers got attached to their students. We got more presents for the bottles of whiskey and things for having helped deliver those babies.
Oh.
So obstetrics and casualty were both very good. But then pediatrics, I got a bit interested. We had a month in pediatrics, and it was interesting, but in those days you couldn't go straight into pediatrics anyway, so I just put it on the side. And then quite halfway through my 3 years in UCH, I had the sudden chance to go to Africa. I saw an advertisement on the student notice board, said single-handed missionary in Zambia requires student helper. And 11 days I was at the Victoria Falls with this guy at a conference. And I flew out there, and for 3 months I lived and slept and breathed as a pretend doctor. And he gave me operations to do and helped with this, and I saw that. And that was sort of life-changing, partly with my father's mission experience. This was a mission hospital. I felt so at home there, even though I wasn't actually that religious, that I actually wept when I left, because I knew I would never get I would never get back there or see the same experience. But I swore, I'm going to go to Africa.
That's incredible.
So
you followed in your father's footsteps in many ways there. And was your father around to to celebrate that?
Absolutely.
Yes.
No, so that was great. I came back qualified, and then had the very first year of virtually prisoner in hospital on call all the time for 365 days, when you said goodbye to all your friends and sold your car, and that was tough. And then I was kind of waiting after I qualified for famous people to come to me and said, Speight, I'd like you to be my junior. And no one came. I realized I was on my own, and I had to kind of apply for other jobs and things. I was very lucky, because with Cambridge and UCH, I kind of walked into the next few jobs. And then you couldn't do pediatrics anyway. And so I had to get my membership, which is for physicians. So I did medical jobs, and I passed my membership eventually.
Fantastic. And then what happened, Nigel? So how old would you be at this chapter in your life?
I was then about 28.
Yeah, late 20s.
I was married, and we had we hadn't yet had children, and I was wondering what I should do next. And I'd always said I wanted to go back to Africa. So pediatrics was on the back burner, and I'd done quite a lot of medicine, and I got my MRCP, and a friend who'd worked with me at UCH was in Dar es Salaam, and she wrote to me saying they're starting a new medical school in Tanzania. Why don't you apply? So with my membership, I put in an application and they sent me my air tickets. I don't think I even had an interview.
Well done, Nigel. Well, doesn't that just show how revered you were and
No,
how...
no,
No?
it showed how hard up they were. When I
Yes.
went there, it was a population of 13 million people, and there were only 5 people with the MRCP in the country, including my professor. And I went there as an adult physician, and I had the 4 best years of my life almost.
Yeah.
Just living and breathing and teaching and working and running. And I learned Swahili and I did this and I did that and I climbed Kilimanjaro and everything.
Did you?
Yeah. And we
How was that? Wait a moment. You climbed Kilimanjaro. Tell us about that, Nigel.
I got altitude sickness.
Did
I
you?
felt bloody awful, horrible headache, vomited. My heart was going 180. And I just got to the top and didn't know it. And then I could hear the fluid crackling in my lungs, and a friend gave me some diuretics and saved my life. But it was, and no, I didn't enjoy it. And
you climbed Kilimanjaro. And you also were integral, as you say, somebody that with your qualifications, not very many of you to that level. And what did you gain from there?
I learned a hell of a lot.
Yeah.
I actually learned quite a lot of things I hadn't understood before. I had some very bright students. The Tanzanian students were incredibly bright. I've never had any feelings of racial superiority because of the color of my skin. You can see in a country like that, the people who get into medicine are at the top of a very broad-based pyramid. And they used to give seminars and they'd explain things. I'd say, gosh, I never understood that.
Oh, that's fantastic. So you were learning as well. So you were learning more and more.
But I also learned a lot, just experience about how to do the important things, the crucial things. If you just behave like a Western doctor and spent half an hour on the first patient, 4 other patients might have died before you got there. You had to prioritize it, divide the ward up, send the students to do that patient, and this sort of thing. You had to really think on your feet and cut corners, and you realize you couldn't use these rather luxury Western medical ideas that you do a test and wait for the results. You had to make your mind up before the patient died. And I coined a motto, treatment before diagnosis, rather than diagnosis before treatment.
Well,
model. And you know, I learned a lot. I saw a lot. My first round, though, I went on, and my junior doctor had just admitted 30 adult patients the night before, no sleep, and he was due to present to me on the round the next day because doctors weren't allowed to sleep in those days. And I was all set for him to explain it all, and he was sent to Ghana with the government, with the football team, and I didn't have him to take me around, and there wasn't a registrar because we were short-staffed, and I had to do a ward round without speaking the language, using visualized notes. So I decided to learn Swahili at that stage, and I eventually ended up quite good. I could run a clinic in Swahili.
Congratulations. Well, there your education has served you very, very well, and so you've experienced this. You've also learnt. What was your quote there that was most profound?
Treatment before diagnosis.
And that has served you well in this particular field moving forward. So you got a wealth of support and learning experience there, and what a beautiful place, you know, to experience. And as you say, you know, Westerners, sometimes we don't realize how lucky we are in you know the general modality of doctorhood over here. But as we are pointing out today, my particular condition, ME, the condition that you're a professional in, is still slightly underserved, sadly. So you experience that. You're in your late 20s. You come back home, and then what happens next, Nigel?
Well, by that stage, I'd had 2 kids.
Okay, well done.
and it was absolutely fascinating. We took our daughter out when she was 6 months, and we had our son doing my second. We had 2 2-year terms. My son was born in Tanzania.
Oh, wow.
We had a frightening experience because my wife ruptured her membranes at 26 weeks. And we thought that was the end. and everyone said, fly back to the Hammersmith. And we said, well, we'll see what nature. And in the end, we just put my wife to bed. And every time she stood up, there was a pool on the floor. So we put her back to bed. She managed to go to term, and I'm very grateful that my son was born a rather dry labour. I had to supervise it because there was no one else around. And he came out fine.
Oh,
and
thank
he's
goodness.
now a doctor.
I was just going to say, influence on your children. You've got a son who's a doctor.
He's a great doctor, and he's spent 8 years of his life in Africa.
Has he?
Charity work, HIV, all sorts of things, yes.
Oh, wow.
And he won the Conan Doyle Prize for the best graduate born in Southern Africa when he went to Edinburgh University.
Congratulations. Are we allowed to say his name at all?
He's called Colin.
Dr. Colin Speight, and he's obviously taken his grandfather's talents and commitment, and also it's gone down through the line with yourself and then been passed on to him. That's incredible. And
when he was in Kenya, he took me up Mount Kenya, which was much nicer than Kilimanjaro.
Thankfully he's survived this birth, and thankfully he's now following in your great footsteps. What happens next, Nigel, in your world?
It was probably one of the worst periods of my life. I was happier than ever in Tanzania, and I was kicked out by a conspiracy of jealous Americans and possibly vested interests. I had campaigned against the drug industry, selling expensive drugs. I never quite got to the bottom of who it was, but I'd already had my contract renewed. But then the balance of power shifted in the faculty and faculty politics, and this jealous American who happened to be in charge said that I shouldn't be reappointed, and I hadn't planned on that. We were absolutely adjusted there, speaking the language, everything. And for 6 months I felt like I had cancer. People didn't sit next to me at coffee, and we appealed to the Senate, and they postponed it till the week before we had to fly. So that was a bad time, and I came back. We hadn't planned on it. Came back to England with our 2 kids, sort of all of a sudden, and I had to decide what to do with the rest of my life.
Yeah,
I was 32 then, and then that's when, having had our 2 kids, I've been so fascinated in them. I looked at the medical jobs, and all my referees had died anyway, and I had to rebuild my career from scratch, and I decided to change to pediatrics. So I went from being God's gift to Africa to being a senior house officer in neonates in Southampton.
Oh, so congratulations.
Warmth. And the next 8 years were very tough. Junior doctors working very hard. So I'd been a consultant in Africa, and now I had to go back to being junior. And fortuitously, firstly, that horrible expulsion from Tanzania was probably the best thing that happened to me, because if I'd stayed on, would have got back into sending kids to boarding school, and it taught me that there was no security in Tanzania. And we did go back 5 years later just to kind of heal, and I taught my former students for 3 months doing pediatrics. But I then kind of, with quite a lot of seniority and experience, I went around the country looking at different pediatric centres, and it was almost a reverse interview situation, that they had to convince me that I wanted to work there. It was quite an interesting time, because for a few months I didn't know where I was going to go, and at the end of the day I ended up in Newcastle, which was one of the best decisions of our life. Again, a very fine department. And again, I think my previous experience and my father's experience and everything led my advisors to point me to Newcastle, where I was welcomed with open arms by a professor, a very fine old English gentleman called John Webb, who's sadly passed away, who had been a missionary in India for 17 years.
My goodness.
Running the Vellore Christian Medical College.
So you had a lot of attributes that you shared and a lot of information and understanding. Is that correct?
It was just a natural, we just understood where we were both coming from.
Yeah.
Not only did I not have to apply, I went up to look at it. The professor met me at the station and took me home to stay in his house.
Wow.
And
Well, it doesn't get any better than that, does it?
He promised me a job on that visit. And in those days, if a professor promised you a job, you got it. And I did my next 8 years training in paediatrics in Newcastle. It was a
My
very
goodness. So you've done a lot of actual training. How many years in this sort of journey would you say that you've actually done in your, quality training years? Because you've done your 3-year degree just for starters. And how long has it taken for you to actually qualify in the paediatrics?
Well, I became a consultant when I was 40.
Okay, my goodness.
Nowadays they make it at about 32, but going to Africa and changing specialties took up time. But I was very happy in Newcastle. I got a very good academic job and did some very interesting research on underdiagnosis of childhood asthma and that sort of thing. I also did a lot of work on child abuse and saw some real child abuse. And it's funny that I now spend my time defending innocent families against social workers. In those days, I was called the hawk who was pushing social workers to protect children. I've been to court over 50 times on quite nasty cases, and that was a major interest of mine, child protection. So that was all as a trainee, or as a, but I was quite senior at that stage. And then I got the job in Durham.
Nigel, I just want to introduce my little dog Tinker, because he's part of this channel. And and to say hello to Dr. Nigel Speight is an absolute privilege and an honour. So I just add that in at this interlude. And as we move forwards, I just want to say what happened next, Nigel, to you. You had moved from Newcastle and you're now in Durham, and you lead us on into that.
Just interesting that the decision to come to Durham, I had a very fine doctor, one of my heroes, who worked with Professor Webb, and he was the late Professor Michael Parkin. He's a lovely person, very wise, and he was the sort of person that everyone went to for advice and counselling and this sort of thing. And tragically, this lovely man died at the age of 54, cycling to church on a Sunday morning. And we all felt a great sense of loss. But I went to him when I was looking at consultant jobs, and I wondered whether I should stay in Newcastle and go for an academic job and be very ambitious and successful. And he said, well, he was a very wise guy. He didn't give you advice. He'd ask you a bit more about yourself. He knew me quite well, but he said, well, if you want to think academic success and that sort of thing is the most important thing, I'll try and stay on in Newcastle. But if you're looking for a balanced sort of life with family and this sort of thing, Durham's one of the top jobs in the district. And oh yeah, well, that's the kind of person I am. And he was such a lovely person. He filled Durham Cathedral for his memorial service.
Did he?
And in his memory, we raised a fund which has helped to pay bursaries to students doing elective periods in the third world, like I did in Zambia. For 3 or 4 students a year, a bursary from his memorial fund keeps tipping the balance towards students being able to go and do something in the third world.
Oh, so what a wonderful man he was. And a direct inspiration on yourself as well, with very similar backdrops. So that's beautiful to hear.
He had one other lovely comment he made when we announced that we'd unexpectedly produced another pregnancy in our family.
Not too unexpectedly.
he looked at us wisely and said, "I'm always sorry for people who go for people where life goes according to plan."
So you're now introducing your 3rd child, as you say, at this age.
That was the 4th, but that's confidential.
Oh, this is the 4th. Oh my goodness. So you have.
Again, I say something about those training years. I felt that being a registrar, as in pediatrics, already the parent of 2 children, made me far more empathetic with anxious parents than a junior doctor who's just qualified and can't understand why the mother's bursting into tears.
Oh, of course.
And, you know, we had a lovely mission statement. We didn't put it over our ward, but we should have done when I went to Durham. There's no such thing as an over-anxious mother.
Perfect. Oh, perfect. And so now you have 4 beautiful children and a beautiful wife as well, of course, who's she's following in your mother's footsteps, am I right?
Yes, she's a very campaigning sort of person. She majored in motherhood, as they did in those days, and was a teacher. Several times got back to teaching, and surprise, surprise, about 20 years ago, developed ME.
And can we say what your wife's name is for anybody that's watching?
Heather.
Heather. So a big hello to Heather for lending your husband for the day as well. And so basically, Heather sadly has also developed ME. How many years ago did you say, Nigel?
It's over 20.
Over 20 years. My goodness. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that.
And that was way after I'd already developed an interest in ME.
Wow. So you basically, just jumping back slightly further from there, you'd come over from this incredibly inspirational gentleman up in Newcastle, and you moved to Durham, and take us through what got you into the process of looking after ME patients.
Well, it was that first girl in her wheelchair. I had no difficulty believing in it from the beginning. Her parents were already in this charity, and then a lovely lady GP called Rosemary Woods already sympathised and supported a lot of ME patients, and she invited the late Dr. Betty Dowsett to Durham to give a lecture. And I went to that lecture, and it blew my mind, because she just explained what ME was, made it real, gave us the diagnostic pointers, and I said, gosh, yes, I can diagnose it now. And so that was and they were, as I say, they were the 2 other GPs, Richardson and Spur, and the Betty Dowsett and Rosemary Woods. They were all ahead of me, but I was the paediatrician, and the word got around, I believed in it, and they started coming.
That's incredible. What can I ask what year this would be? Because that's quite profound.
I think it was getting on for mid to late 80s.
Yeah. And this little girl shows up. So you're seeing lots of different children with lots of different conditions as a paediatrician. And this one little girl appears and changes your whole world.
And Betty Dowsett says that there was a worldwide epidemic of Coxsackie B in the 80s. And the number I had in Durham over those next 10 years was really quite excessive. And I was accused of over-diagnosing it by a jealous psychiatrist. You know, but basically I had my hands full with all these patients, but naturally the ones in the northern region, other doctors who hadn't experienced my
level of expertise in it, really,
asked me for second opinions, and patients asked for my opinion, and everything went very smoothly for 5 to 10 years without any controversy. There were no disbelieving cases in the north of England, because everyone worked with me and respected. And Alan Franklin was looking after the south of England. I then got in with the other leaders at the time. There was a lovely chap called David Lewis from Aberystwyth, and I heard him. I ran a joint paediatric psychiatry colloquium with residential weekends, and I invited David Lewis to speak against a child psychiatrist about ME being an organic condition, and he put on a really beautiful thing. So the first 10 years, there was no controversy.
Wow, how beautiful, because perhaps other doctors who are watching today might actually say, well, where I was, we didn't have those links, we didn't know about your work, and that's the purpose of today. We are now in 2024, and we do need to understand that how much things have changed because of the 2021 NICE guidelines update, and how your work has been instrumental as a contribution to making those changes, because it was a filtered process, and one by one, many people have collaborated to make that change, but you have been a through line of that, Nigel, and I commend your spirit and your enthusiasm and your persistence in the face of adversity.
The next was the controversial cases.
Yeah.
And if you took the typical case, it would be a pediatrician not believing that it was physical, referring to a child psychiatrist, and often in those days recommending graded exercise, and the parents naturally demurring, asking for second opinions, and being punished by the pediatrician for that. There was a famous case in Solihull very early on where the pediatrician referred to psychiatry and graded exercise. They asked for my second opinion, and he refused to allow them to have a second opinion and took a court order to prevent it. And the judge ruled against that and said people are entitled to second opinions, and he lost. And funnily enough, the barrister who won that case, someone McFarlane, is now the president of the family court. A very fine lawyer, and he's, and that was the first, I think that was the first controversy I was involved in, just to give a second opinion so that people don't have to do things the doctors have ordered them to do. But then there was the terrible case in Great Ormond Street, and this was shown at the Panorama program, Sick and Tired.
Yeah.
And at that time, there was a child psychiatrist going around who claimed that he had a cure for ME and that they should all be sent to him. He was very influential in the Midlands and in Great Ormond Street, and he was invited to lecture on ME to the College of Pediatrics AGM, and he showed photos of a little boy curled up in his mother's fur coat in the middle of August as a joke. Said, look what a fake this guy is. Whereas in fact, to you and me, it means he's having trouble with temperature control even in the summer.
Yeah.
And everyone laughed heartily, and it was a funny thing. And he did the same lecture to an annual meeting of paediatricians in Cambridge. And I demanded a right of reply, and the next year, and gave a lecture on ME, the organic case, the case for it being organic. And we won on a show of hands at the end of that lecture.
Congratulations.
51 said physical, 49 said physical and psychiatric, which is fence sitting, and 1 said purely psychiatric.
And that one was probably him. Yeah.
Anyway, this child psychiatrist, this was the first horror story that I experienced. And in fact, I couldn't get a toe in the door because things had already gone too far. But Dr. Franklin and Dr. Weir were both trying to defend him. This was an 11-year-old boy from the East Anglia who had already been heavily traumatized by a hospital admission with forced physiotherapy. His father had sworn an oath that he would never let him be admitted to hospital again. The child psychiatrist from Great Ormond Street, the boy got worse. Child psychiatrist from Great Ormond Street took a court order and compelled his admission to the psychiatric ward of Great Ormond Street. The father, true to his promise, took the boy abroad and left him with grandparents. But when the father came back, he was arrested at Heathrow and put straight into Pentonville for abducting a ward of court, even though it was his son. And then things settled for a few days, and then he was told that if he didn't sacrifice the boy, his wife would be joining him in Holloway the next week. So he had to sacrifice his son, who was admitted to Great Ormond Street on the psychiatric ward for physiotherapy.
It's almost, for anybody listening today, it's almost unbelievable.
And the judge said that anyone who reveals the name of the boy, the name of the hospital, the name of the social services will be subject to either jail sentence and or sequestration of assets.
Goodness.
The charity at the time very bravely sent a sack full of get well cards, which they delivered.
Yeah.
And Panorama very bravely went, and I think there was a Channel 4 one as well, with Duncan Campbell, and they had, I'm not allowed to reveal the name of this famous children's hospital behind me, and they described it. And I didn't save that boy. He sent me tapes pleading with me to help him. I couldn't. Alan Franklin and Willie Weir had both been ignored already, and this confident psychiatrist had carried all sway. But then the Countess of Mar wrote to the Attorney General, and following that, the judge decided to drop the wardship, and he was allowed home.
Goodness me.
You know, anyone meddling in that case, even going on Panorama, was risking the judge's wrath.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have done that if he didn't have a guilty conscience, the judge.
Absolutely. And there's also a profound story that you share in my book from a case in the 80s, without mentioning who. If you're, you know, happy to share that particular story, which is quite horrific to hear for anybody that may well be going through difficulties today.
Remind me that
the little boy with the ghost train and so on.
Yeah, that was before my time, but I knew the case well, and I've subsequently met him. And actually, his name is in the public domain.
Okay.
It was written.
I'll let you share the story. I'd like you to share the story there, because this is a very profound story that's also going to appear in my book, The Truth About Me, but in your words, but most importantly, you've actually met this particular patient as well. So tell us the story there.
It was written up in The Guardian in 1990, and I've just had the original article and the letters following it. But this boy was diagnosed in the Isle of Man as ME by his Isle of Man paediatrician, but he felt he'd like a second opinion, and he was sent to London to have the diagnosis confirmed. And it was confirmed by a perfectly sympathetic neurologist, pediatric neurologist. So all should have been well. But a trainee psychiatrist, who will be nameless for the purposes of this, intervened unasked, said he knew a lot about ME, it was his special interest, and this wasn't ME. And it was all due to an overprotective mother, and that the treatment would be to separate them. And the Isle of Man Social Services duly followed his advice, took a court order, and took the boy into hospital and limited the mother's access to him. In other words, Munchausen by proxy, fabricated illness, overprotecting mother. And that psychiatrist now claims that what happened subsequently was not his fault. But what the hospital did to prove he was a fake was to put him in a wheelchair without a safety belt, whiz him around at high speed and stop suddenly to prove that he would be able to stop himself from falling, except he couldn't. So time after time, he fell flat on his face onto the floor. They didn't learn the lesson from their experiment, but just upped the stakes and took him on a ghost train in a fun fair, strapped to his wheelchair, hoping that he would raise his arms to ward off the skeletons and bats flying at him. He was unable to do that either. They still weren't happy that they hadn't proved he was a fake, so they decided to subject him to a variation of the medieval test for witchcraft, and this was to drop him into the hydrotherapy pool to show he could swim. But he couldn't. He was too ill, and they had to fish him out.
Well, I think if that story doesn't break people's hearts and enable parents who don't understand, whether you have a son or a daughter who is a child, or a son or a daughter who is an adult, who is explaining the symptoms, which we'll move on to in a minute, because I want you to describe the symptoms of ME to the public. I don't think there is a more profound story than that harrowing story.
Also think what it's like for the mother not to know this is happening to her son, and to be unable to protect him, and to feel that she's being treated as a witch.
Yes. And it seems to be quite a commonality that doctors put overprotective mother, because I was repeatedly rushed in an ambulance to hospital, which my book will reveal, as a tiny baby under the age 3, and therefore I think my mum in one of the medical notes was called overprotective mother, and the child likes going to hospital. Well, I was having a seizure, my eyes were rolled back and I couldn't breathe, and I was left in a hemiparesis state. So my medical notes state that at the same time as indicating an overprotective mother. So that does seem to be a commonality as a diagnosis of psychosis, if you like. And that in itself is tragic to hear, because it does correlate. So it's really got me, that story. You telling it's quite different to reading it in print. You know, my heart goes out to that poor gentleman who'll now be an adult, of course. So the most important, and that's really the purpose of today, Nigel. It's lovely to hear about you and your background, your wealth of integrity, which to me was the purpose of today. You've given a plethora of talks. You've just come back from Ireland, giving more and more talks on ME and fibromyalgia, which fibromyalgia's got 70%, because I have both, 70% of the same markers as ME. Once again, we now have a new name, long COVID potentially. We've also got Gulf War syndrome was another potential name. There's a whole spectrum of different names that over the generations, over the decades and decades, as you quite rightly said, of abuse of patients, really, with the misunderstanding. One can forgive a professional if they don't understand, that one can forgive a parent if they don't understand. But the greatness of today, and through your work and your fight for the correct diagnosis of this condition for ME, thankfully in 2021 today, we're in a much, much better position. And I implore all the NICE guidelines staff and scientists and doctors to watch today, to learn and hear what has been going on, and how long COVID may well ultimately have the same diagnostic, you know, be the same or a similar diagnostic condition, and therefore needs treating in the same empathetic way, which does not include exercise. Absolutely not. And so with that, I want to ask you today, what should a physician in the shoes of a doctor's general practice, what should they be looking for as potential diagnostics of ME?
Well, firstly, like Dr. Franklin said very wisely, that doctors should realize that a characteristic collection of symptoms which breeds true is a syndrome. It's a clinical syndrome. We still don't know enough about ME to call it a disease, because we, according to Koch's postulates, but it's such a clear, like if it's lays duck eggs, looks like a duck, quacks, it's a duck. And that's the way you should approach it. In fact, NICE guidelines have made it even simpler. But as you know, the list of symptoms can be very long. But, yeah. And the other thing is, rather than having to go and see a big specialist to get diagnosed, I wish the day would come when it's part of the core competence of a GP and a paediatrician and a common or garden physician, rather than, I think, having to see a specialist. The same's happening with long COVID. Oh, I haven't been trained in long COVID, I couldn't comment. But every doctor should try to make a diagnosis on the balance of probability at the first instance.
Well, so, I think that's very wise words coming from somebody with your medical understanding and background. Yeah,
it's very simple, and I joke that you could teach a 12-year-old Boy Scout to diagnose ME in half an hour.
Yeah,
you need a bit more than 10 minutes. You have to make the time, and it's time well spent. If you do make the time to take a decent history, and you allow them more than one symptom, which some doctors don't, you have to allow them all the symptoms. And as you actually take the history, you're actually validating the patient experience and showing you believe them to write them down. Time after time, I'd say, didn't you tell Dr. So-and-so about the tiredness? He said, yes, but he wouldn't write it down. So we kind of,
it's interesting.
The taking of a history and being willing to spend the time to take a good history is almost the cardinal beginning. Then I personally don't like the term fatigue.
Yeah.
hate the term chronic fatigue syndrome, and what I call it is reduced energy levels.
Okay.
This is the one catch, the art of taking the history, which you'd have to teach the 10, 12-year-old Boy Scout, is actually to elicit a history of post-exertional worsening.
Yes.
And so a lot of patients you meet are already living naturally within their limits, and they're not complaining. I met a lady at one of the discussion groups before NICE who said, well, I can't have ME because I don't have post-exertional worsening. I've only got chronic fatigue syndrome, which is rubbish. And I said, well, what would happen if you had to go and climb mountains in the Lake District? Oh, I couldn't do that.
Yeah.
And so they don't suffer worsening because they're not exposing themselves. So the question in Durham, I used to ask people who were there just well enough to go to school, but they couldn't do this and they couldn't do that, but they weren't complaining that much. And it's important to diagnose mild ME, so you can warn them.
Yeah.
And I'd say, just say the Germans were invading and they'd reached York and they were coming north at 30 miles a day, and you had to get to the Scottish border with a small rucksack on foot. Would you make it? Oh, no way, I'd curl up behind a hedge.
Yes.
So you have to ask them a question that kind of demonstrates that they would have post-exertional worsening if they exerted themselves.
And I think that's profound, Doctor, because the post-exertional malaise has now been clinically put forward as the primary indicator of our condition.
Cardinal symptom, and it's almost unique to ME.
Yeah.
That's why long COVID ME can call itself long COVID ME and fibromyalgia, because they've all got this, or if they've got it, they've got it. Now so you've got your reduced energy levels, post-exertional worsening. Then they put brain fog as one of the cardinals, and some people don't suffer from that, but they would if they exerted themselves.
Yes.
And the other, I think, sleep disturbance, but it's a really very simple thing, and they can have lots of optional extras as well. But I found 90% of my patients have headaches, quite bad headaches.
Yeah.
And the commonest thing I find, and I found this again in Ireland, of half of those patients with troublesome headaches, it's migraine, and migraine's treatable. And if you can treat the migraine, I mean, the first patient I did that with, he's the same chap I did my previous podcast with, Daniel Moore. I improved his migraine so much, the word went round I had a cure for ME. I just had told him to stop eating cheese and probably chocolate. And there are lots of people with migraine who are gaily guzzling chocolate and cheese and no doctors told them.
Well, that's really profound, because I was a cheese eater and a chocolate eater, chocoholic. I wasn't a drinker. Alcohol used to make me very, very sick, which is another indicator, because it's more poison going into the body. And of course, we have an excess level of toxicity in ME patients. But very interesting that you accompany what you've described today with diet, because I also am on a kind of a Mediterranean diet, if you like, a plant-based diet. So the plants are our healers, and you quite rightly say sometimes dairy overload, for example, can be a trigger, not in everybody, but what I have personally found is no gluten, no dairy, no wheat, no sugar, no fun, but actually let the body replenish and heal.
You can do lots of diet. And just while we're on the subject of migraine, can I let you into a secret which deserves spreading, which I'm probably the only doctor propagating it at the moment in the country, because the man who discovered it, the late Professor George Russell from Aberdeen, did it, and he's now died. And he was a brilliant expert on migraine, and he studied it in all its forms. It's a fascinating condition. And he studied people with head migraine, and then before that, a lot of kids have abdominal migraine. And that's hardly recognised when I tell parents their child's got it. Oh, I've never heard of that, doctor. And then the mother came back and said, remember you told me my child had abdominal migraine? I said, I just read about it in Woman's Own, so you must be right.
Yes.
10 to 15% of children have migraine in one form. Now, what George Russell did, and this is absolutely fascinating, he went back in their childhoods and they had growing pains in their legs.
Yes.
The kind where the mother has to wake up at 4 a.m. and rub the legs. And that's probably migraine on the legs. And I had a boy who had growing pains from 2 till 4, abdominal migraine from 5 till 10, and then head migraine. And the other thing they have is travel sickness, which is a marker.
Well, that is all outlined in my childhood, in my own story.
Growing pains?
Yes, because I've got Ellis-Dan loss, and as a little girl, of course, I could put my elbows on the floor. So it's to do with the joint hypermobility in a subset as well. Again, these are all subsets, but I happen to have the plethora of subsets, which is why I'm strongly that's the reason I've written the book, because I had to put the jigsaw pieces together. So it's incredible that you've just highlighted that. And
pains are episodic, though, like a head migraine. They come and they go.
That's it. And 10 years before I collapsed, I say in the book that I went to my GP with my hand on my head and I said, this is going to sound silly, but I feel as if my brain is trying to explode through the top of my head. It's burning hot, and it's as if somebody is crushing my skull. And my extent, when Dr. Perrin held my skull, this would be in 2016, it took 2 whole years to find him. He said to me, "You have got one of the most inflamed brains that I've ever held in my hands, and I cannot believe you're smiling." So the reason I'm sharing this today, and so grateful for your time today in sharing your experiences with multiple patients, is because they do all have overlapping symptomology. And what we don't want to happen is for my story to ever happen again, because Dr. Perrin, I'm in Dr. Perrin's science book as well as one of the most toxic poison patients ever in history to survive. And that is why my power for the cause, like yours, is so strong, because no human being should ever go to the inhumane level of torture. It was like I was being crushed with a concrete slab and set on fire, and I wasn't believed by many. And I have to say that this has to change. And if in telling this today, this changes, well, then that's going to have significant impact ahead, as you quite rightly said, for the new subset of patients, which is the long COVID patients. We don't put them on exercise bikes to see what happens, because they could actually end up having a heart attack. You're very similar, Dr. Perrin has explained to me, and I want to ask you to, heart pains and things like that. Your heart's under sufferance, as well as the brain and all the other parts of the body. Would you agree with that before we close today, Nigel?
Yeah, because I'd just like to go back to the diagnosis again, though. That, as I say, they're very simple guidelines.
Yeah.
They all say that you have to exclude other things, and routine blood tests will exclude all the other things. But thirdly, to say that following them and taking a careful history and having an open mind, I've now seen over, way over 1,000 cases.
Yeah.
I find it comforting to tell people that if you follow those rules and take the history properly, you get it right 98% of the time. I've made mistakes. I've missed one boy I thought had ME. Turned out he had narcolepsy. The mother put me straight. Another very tragic case, turned out that she'd had Lyme disease all along, which I hadn't ever heard of. And she eventually died of Lyme disease. And there are 1 or 2 catches, but basically you should err on the side of committing yourself. There's no 100% in this world. So I often say, on the balance of strong probability, this constellation of symptoms justifies a firm diagnosis of ME.
And what I'm hearing you today say is that the NICE guidelines 2021, should any medics be watching today, or patients or parents of patients, please take a good look at the current NICE guidelines and absorb the symptomology that's written within there. As you say, there's enough information out there. They can attach themselves to either Dr. Raymond Perrin, to Dr. Willie Weir, to yourself, Dr. Nigel Speight, and all of you pioneers who have the hearts of gold, the strength of character to step outside of the clinical box and say, I don't think this is correct. There's something more to this. And all of you symbiotically have encouraged the health care professionals today to take the correct diagnosis, the correct treatment plans ahead, and long may they continue to do so with any other health conditions ahead of today moving forwards. And I just want to say, to leave you with the final word, Nigel, but to say what an absolute honour and privilege it is, not only to have you inside my book, but also to have you on this podcast today. And you're a true hero to so many and have saved so many lives. And I know you've worked in tandem with Dr. Perrin, who's been helping me. But I just want to say to you personally, thank you so much, because it's people like you that stand the test of time. You're the true heroes of this world. And thank you so, so much. And I'd leave the last word to you, Nigel.
Well, thank you for all those kind words. But for parents and patients, Dr. Spock used to say this to parents: trust your instincts. Don't follow advice that doesn't seem right.
Yes.
You know, I've seen so many cases, perfectly intelligent people, more intelligent than their doctors, and yet they've done what the doctor told them to do because he must be right. Doctors are not infallible. So trust your instincts and just ask questions and hold back rather than going on to things that don't make sense.
And I think, Nigel, with 3 generations of doctors in your own personal history, your wonderful father, your wonderful son ahead, may they continue in your wealth of integrity, honesty, kindness and care for humanity. And I'm so proud and honoured, as I say, to have had you on today. And thank you. Moving forward, I wish you all the very best ahead, and long may we continue to save lives between us with opportunities like this and everything you've gone through. So many, many thanks. What an inspiration you are, the wonderful Dr. Nigel Speight. Thank you so, so much.
It's been lovely talking to you.